The case selection of Baltimore was chosen neither randomly nor for its generalizable significance. Baltimore was selected because of my personal history, along with a greater than national average percentage of vulnerable persons. As I've been researching this topic, I also happened across the Weather.com's 2005 Climate Disruption Index, which ranks Baltimore as the 12th most at-risk city for climate change-related effects. However, the lack of a stringent standard for selecting Baltimore does not make the selection an innately poor decision. Baltimore is located in a relatively unbroken corridor of dense urban developments along the United States eastern seaboard, which stretches from Washington, D.C. through New Haven, Connecticut. In comparison to other U.S. cities, using 2010 census data, Baltimore is the 21st largest city in the United States. Baltimore is the largest city in the state of Maryland and houses roughly 11% of Maryland's population. The metropolitan statistical area the Baltimore anchors houses nearly half of Maryland's population. Of further concern is Baltimore's poverty rate. The 2013 5-year American Community Survey calculated Baltimore's poverty rate at 23.8%, compared to Maryland's rate of 9.8%, and the national rate of 15%. Comparatively speaking, within the United States, Maryland does not face an abnormal risk to extreme heat events. With that stated, the gross number of vulnerable persons is projected to triple by 2050. Well, current climate science places the projected number of days at or above a heat index of 105 degrees Fahrenheit at 47 days by 2050, up from a historical count of 8 such days in the year 2000. With this evidence to support the wisdom of selecting Baltimore as its case study location, the primary driver behind the selection is my personal connection to Baltimore. I'm a native Baltimorean, while my wife's family immigrated into the Baltimore MSA. We met while teaching at Title I middle school in neighboring Baltimore County. We plan on returning to the Northeast and eventually settling in Baltimore or nearby when we decide to establish our family. Therefore, beyond an ethical stake, I have a personal stake in the long-term safety of Baltimoreans. The 1995 Chicago heat wave is one of the deadliest, if not deadliest, extreme heat events to impact the United States. It also serves as an example of municipal emergency planning failures. Uncovered during post-disaster auditing was the government's inability to identify a pattern of excess morbidity and mortality events during the early days of the heat wave. Since 1995, government response to heat waves has greatly expanded. Cities incorporate extreme heat events in hazard mitigation plans, which were only occurring on the state level in 1995. City 311 information lines can be used by citizens to contact their local government, as opposed to only the 911 emergency line in 1995. And reverse 911 calls can be placed to all persons in a given geographic area to provide warnings and instructions. Potentially, most importantly, computing technology allows city officials to identify trends and abnormalities in morbidity and mortality. Local government is not the only level to fail to prepare, mitigate, respond, and recover to a natural disaster. Hurricane Katrina is easily the most recognizable failure of federal emergency planning. The Senate committee report on Katrina highlighted, among others, a series of overarching failures. A failure to prepare for a foreign disaster, insufficient actions or poor decisions immediately before and during a hazard event, ineffective leadership, and the failure to, over time, develop the capacity for a coordinated response to a truly catastrophic event. With these failures in mind, it is important to remember the 10th Amendment states that powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This is known as federalism. However, local and state governments can quickly be overwhelmed by the size, scope, or cost of a disaster event. The Stafford Act of 1988 gives the federal government the authority to assist states during a declared state of emergency, that is, after the start of a disaster, if a state's governor so requests. In order to provide localities an incentive to mitigate disaster damage through prior planning, the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 was passed. The Disaster Mitigation Act requires that a locality have an active hazard mitigation plan which meets the requirements set forth in the Code of Federal Regulations at Title 44, Chapter 1, Part 201. The federal government recognizes that local governments, especially towns or non-urban areas, may lack the expertise or necessary funding to develop the undertaking of a hazard mitigation plan effort. To assist, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, published the Local Mitigation Plan Handbook in 2013, along with MitigationGuide.com, to provide a structure for a hazard mitigation plan effort. The Local Mitigation Plan Handbook takes mitigation planning beyond the base requirements of the Stafford Act and Disaster Mitigation Act. Although Baltimore's Hazard Mitigation Plan is held as an exemplary plan on the MitigationGuide.com website, it still does not contain all the best practices recommended in the handbook. This brings me to the overarching goal of my professional report. Baltimore is required by federal regulation to submit an amended hazard mitigation plan by 2018 if she wants to remain eligible for federal hazard mitigation funds. A full-scale revision is the realm of a paid team of professionals. I want to focus on a single topic: extreme heat events. Since the 1980s, when the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency began tracking deaths from all hazards, extreme heat events are the #1 killer in America, averaging more than 1,200 deaths per year from 2014 to 2013. They're also among the costliest, though much of the economic cost is associated with prolonged drought events, which result in lost agricultural crops. I'll be focusing on more acute events, heat waves lasting days to weeks, not months to years. If 4-digit death tolls and the average deadliest U.S. disaster does not quite raise the alarm, it helps look at the suffering caused by extreme heat events in other countries. The European heat wave of 2003 attributed more than 70,000 deaths, including more than 20,000 in France alone. The Russian heat wave of 2010 resulted in more than 55,000 deaths. Of curious importance is that a majority of these world's deadliest heat waves have occurred in the past 30 years. I'm unsure if this is due to the increased intensity and duration of heat waves, or improved identification of extreme heat event-related mortalities. With a number of possible deaths fresh in your mind, we need to examine who are the people most likely to die during a heat wave. Susan Cutter of the University of South Carolina has developed a social vulnerability index. Cutter used statistical regression to identify explanatory risk factors that underlie the inability to cope with natural disasters. Just 10 characteristics account for nearly 75% of social vulnerability within a given census tract during a hazard event. Of particular interest during extreme heat events are the elderly and extremely young, as well as low income, primarily due to the potential lack of air conditioning or the ability to pay for large utility bills, along with income-correlated health issues such as asthma and diabetes. On top of humankind's recent experience with extreme heat events, Al Gore was not wrong. Climate change is not a debated topic in the scientific community, although it is still contested in the U.S. political sphere. The U.S. heatwave season has increased in length. The number of individual heatwave events have increased in frequency and intensity across the United States. Projections highlight the continuing increase of the frequency and intensity of heat waves over the impending decades. Climate change and natural disasters pose a particular risk to the socially vulnerable due to less adaptation capacity and greater potential exposure to climate change effects. When these populations are located in older urbanized areas of the United States, they are especially vulnerable to extreme heat event-related excess mortality and morbidity. Unless cities directly identify and incorporate social vulnerability in planning documents, it is unlikely for a city to effectively mitigate the disaster risks prior to disaster events. The primary question being pursued is, what does an exemplary extreme heat hazard mitigation plan look like for the city of Baltimore? The answer to this question will be pursued through a case study of Baltimore City. The research to this question is divided into two primary sections. One, questions answered from current planning and hazard mitigation literature, and two, questions answered from outside planning and hazard mitigation literature. Although Baltimore's hazard mitigation plan is considered an exemplary plan, answers to observed shortcomings will be pursued through existing plan and literature. How can Baltimore incorporate social vulnerability into hazard mitigation planning efforts? In fall extreme heat events, what are successful strategies incorporated into city planning and disaster response efforts are highlighted in academic and journalistic research? These questions rest upon the assumption that there are groups of people more vulnerable to extreme heat events, that it's possible to effectively address these vulnerabilities without addressing society's systemic issues. The lack of usable knowledge addressing social vulnerability in Baltimore's current hazard mitigation plan is a serious deficit. By answering the first set of questions, Baltimore will have a more complete picture on which residents to prioritize in mitigation efforts, as well as having established the beginning of a more comprehensive mitigation effort. This professional report seeks to establish a new level of competence in extreme heat mitigation planning. It will take more than a review of best practices in order to establish Baltimore's new hazard mitigation plan, extreme heat mitigation portion, as a national benchmark. To establish this benchmark, I will pursue the following research questions. What are social or psychological impediments to successfully implementing hazard mitigation plans before and during a hazard event? And should extreme heat hazard mitigation efforts target persons over property? Answers to the second set of questions will potentially be found in the literature from the fields of public health and psychology. Baltimore has concentrated plan efforts on green infrastructure improvements to mitigate the effects of extreme heat hazards. The director of Baltimore's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response recently opined at the difficulty of effectively communicating heat risks to the general public. These questions seek to establish a new focus on effective risk mitigation communication in order for Baltimoreans to more appropriately respond to extreme heat event when it next occurs. The research centers around three key Baltimore-specific documents: the city's hazard mitigation plan, the city's sustainability plan, and the city's climate action plan, as critically analyzed through the lens of disaster resiliency. The relevant information regarding extreme heat events within these documents will be compared to the Department of Homeland Security Plan Recommendation and FEMA's Local Mitigation Plan and Handbook. To gain a better understanding of extreme heat events in the context of Baltimore, it will be necessary to obtain documentation of past extreme heat events and hazard mitigation planning in Baltimore. Of importance may be the public records of administrative documents and formal studies from the following government agencies: Baltimore's Office of Sustainability and Baltimore's Department of Planning for planning documents and public participation, the Baltimore City Health Department, particularly the Division of Aging and Care Services, and the Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene for mortality and morbidity information, Baltimore Mayor's Office on Disabilities, the Housing Authority of Baltimore City Public Schools, Baltimore City Fire Department, the Baltimore City Police Department, and Baltimore City Sheriff's Office for information regarding at-risk populations, Baltimore's Mayor's Office of Emergency Management, and the Maryland Emergency Management Agency for disaster preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery information. Important local news sources to consult include the major daily newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, the flagship African American weekly newspaper, the Baltimore Afro-American, and two important alternative weekly news sources, the Baltimore Brew and Baltimore City Paper. An important aspect will also be archival research, especially Census and American Community Survey data, Geographic Information System databases, and prior survey data. This Census and American Community Survey data, combined with GIS databases, will be crucial for identifying and mapping vulnerable communities as defined by Susan Cutter. Prior survey data, if it is available, will potentially be useful for identifying vulnerable communities through self-identification. The third potential avenue for data collection is conducting semi-structured phone interviews with local government officials. While the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 44, Chapter 1, Subchapter D, Part 201, Section 201.6, the requirements of local mitigation plans, states that an open public involvement process is essential to the development of an effective plan, it only requires an opportunity for the public to comment on the plan during the drafting stage and prior to plan approval. Any official plan initiative will ideally include a more robust public participation process. However, a public participation process for this professional report will not be pursued due to time and funding constraints. To wrap it up, historical accounts of extreme heat events can be tracked back to at least AD 1252. Modern history coupled with climate projections highlight the frequency of extreme heat events for our generation and the forthcoming generations. Regardless of a person's political view of human-induced climate change and the resultant change in the frequency, intensity, and unpredictability of hazard events, extreme heat events will more than likely continue affecting the general populace. It is a reckless decision to not adequately and fully as possible prepare for the next extreme heat event. Failure to do so will result in lost and damaged lives, damaged infrastructure, and lost economic value. In order to improve the quality of life within Baltimore City, this professional report seeks to strengthen the forthcoming revision of Baltimore's hazard mitigation plan by specifically addressing the extreme heat hazard planning element. By directly tying hazard planning to social vulnerability and proposing additional policies to mitigate the effects of extreme heat before and during an event, Baltimore can establish a stronger, implementable, multi-hazard mitigation program.